Welcome to the SeaTomorrow podcast. Today we have Richard Griffiths from an organisation called Island Conservation. Thank you, Richard, for coming on.
Kia ora, Michael.
Okay. Now, first of all, do you want to just tell us a bit about yourself, what you've done, where you've come from, what you've studied, what you're doing now, all those sorts of things?
Sure. I have been in conservation for nigh on 25 years now. I studied ecology. In fact, I started studying physics initially, but the ecology classes that I attended at university that friends were taking were far more interesting to me, and that led me into the field of ecology. When I left university, I started working for the New Zealand Department of Conservation, whom I worked for 13 years. And in that time, I largely focused on recovering threatened species, island restoration, and invasive species management. In the latter stages of my career with the department, I managed some of the more high-profile eradication projects, such as the removal of kiore from Hauturu, or Little Barrier Island in the Hauraki Gulf, and the removal of eight different invasive species from the islands of Rangitoto and Motutapu. And at the tail end of the Rangitoto and Motutapu project, I was tapped on the shoulder by some staff working in the organisation Island Conservation, and it was just a good time for me to move on, and I've been with Island Conservation now for 8 years.
And what do they do?
Island Conservation has a very simple mission. We focus on recovering threatened species, saving species from extinction by removing invasive species from islands. So our mission is driven by islands and the critical threat that invasive species pose to the threatened species living there.
You're specifically talking about animal species rather than plant?
No,
species?
In terms of recovering species, we don't discriminate. Plant or animal species are important to us. Yeah, Island Conservation is a small but international non-profit organisation, and within the organisation, my focus is the Pacific, and I lead a team of project managers and what we call island restoration specialists to work with communities and governments within the Pacific to tackle the invasive species issue, which is significant.
Right. So why do we need a department of conservation and entities such as Island Conservation?
When you look at the statistics, they are sobering. We are in what people have called the sixth mass extinction, whereby human activities have contributed to significant biodiversity decline, and we stand to lose a huge amount of our biodiversity in coming decades if we don't act. And for us at Island Conservation, we have done the math and looked at the greatest threats to biodiversity globally, and on islands right now it's invasive species. There are some exceptions to that. Of course, there's deforestation and modification of habitat that is going on in places like the Solomons and Papua New Guinea, but in the large part it's invasive species that are causing the declines and the loss of biodiversity at this point in time.
So it's species like rats, stoats, that sort of thing? What can you outline what species are problematic?
The two species that have caused the lion's share of extinctions throughout the world have been rats, and interesting enough, cats, domestic cats, or as we call them, feral cats. Cats are very efficient predators, and when not kept under close supervision, they can wreak havoc, and they have been responsible for a large number of extinctions around the world.
Yeah, and specifically in New Zealand?
Both in New Zealand and globally.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. So essentially it's an arms race, an asymmetrical arms race, where one side, which is the non-indigenous species, has a massive advantage over the indigenous species.
Yes, the indigenous species, or the native species that have evolved on islands, have not developed the set of defensive measures that could help them survive in the presence of these new arrivals. And you take some New Zealand birds, for example, they just don't know how to defend themselves against a stoat or a rat.
Is there any signs of evolution working very, very quickly, and animals actually developing strategies against these predators?
It's certainly not happening quickly enough to save species from extinction. There probably is some behavioural changes occurring. Birds nesting higher off the ground, for example, as the ones that did nest closer to the ground get picked off. But it's too slow, unfortunately, to help those species that are in trouble.
Yeah, well, the difficult thing is they're designed to be quite relaxed in a place like New Zealand, where there were no predators before humans came, and the other thing is the rate of reproduction of things like specifically rats would be very high, wouldn't it?
Yes, rats breed like rabbits or rats.
Yeah.
They do. They can populate an area very quickly.
So your organisation has chosen islands specifically because they essentially have a moat around them. So once you eradicate the problem, it's much easier to use it as a sort of a petri dish to continue the development of the endangered species.
Islands are wonderful in that respect. They have an ocean around them, or a sea around them, that protects them from natural reinvasion. What we have to be careful of is that we don't ourselves bring those pests back or introduce new species that could cause impacts. What we have found is that once invasive species are removed, islands recover very well by themselves in most cases. Populations of threatened species that were under pressure from those invasors will rebound, and we've seen that time and time again in the work we've done.
You have to create a walled garden. It's a bit like that area in Wellington, I think. I can't remember what it's called, but it's a predator-free area where they've literally walled an area of Wellington bush off and removed all the predators from it and allowed that. So that's actually a land island. So you can have these entities on land. It's not just isolated to the sea.
No, New Zealand's really pioneered that mainland sanctuary approach, and the predator fenced areas within New Zealand have been extremely successful in demonstrating the recovery that can result once invasive species are removed.
Why do we care, or why should we care?
I would start by saying that 1 in 10 people on this planet is an islander. We are islanders. We live in large islands, but we are islanders. And we depend on our environment and our biodiversity to survive. I don't have the statistics for you, Michael, but there's plenty of examples of vaccines and medicines that have been either sourced directly or inspired by nature. And we require biodiversity to survive. We need the services such as pollination, seed dispersal, clean water. We cannot do without it.
So we live in the environment, and we're dependent on the environment, and so that the functions, just from a purely pragmatic point of view, the functions that all these species provide, we actually benefit from.
We know that coral reefs are important. They provide food and a source of income for people all across the globe. They literally feed millions of people. We also know that seabirds are critical to the health of these reefs. And the nutrients that seabirds bring with them to the land make their way back into the ocean, where they stimulate coral growth. They stimulate algal growth, which increases the abundance of algal feeding fish, increases the productivity of those nearshore fisheries, and the whole system benefits from the function that seabirds play. So that's just one example of a service that biodiversity provides for us.
Yes, so it's a highly intricate and interconnected network that we have no idea, if we take out one piece of the puzzle, whether the whole edifice will collapse.
Exactly. Ecosystems are extremely interconnected, and if you do take out one component of that, you do risk the entire system collapsing.
The other thing is, if we lose one species or multiple species, we don't actually know what we're losing. With regard to how, for example, you mentioned medical science have used specific compounds, or whatever you want to call them, from specific species, whether that's animal or plant species. And 100 years in the future, we may have technology to utilize stuff that we can't utilize at the moment. So it is actually, it's very precious stuff. If you think of in terms of sort of philosophically, if everything is information, evolution is one of the most highly dense forms of, or it's a process that creates very highly dense forms of information that have taken literally millions and millions and millions of years. And so if we lose that, we're losing millions of years of essentially scientific experimentation that's created these entities. And it's not something that you can just reproduce those in a short space of time. And then you're losing, you're running the risks of the classic unintentional consequences. You remove this species and it affects this. So it's a domino theory. And you can have, the classic term is tipping point, where ecosystems there, you can have an extractive model for so far, and then at some point there's a tipping point and you get exponential collapse. With regard to, one of the things that I'm interested in setting up SeaTomorrow is the state of marine environments. What got me started was when the CEO of the Hauraki Gulf Forum told me that the Hauraki Gulf was an ecological collapse. Now, I've sailed on the Gulf all my life from the age of 7, and we used to sail through flocks of birds. It would take 5-10 minutes to sail through them. There would be literally thousands of birds. Now, I went around the Gulf recently, and I spent a weekend out there, and I saw 10 birds. Now, it's completely anecdotal in one sense, but when you go out into the Gulf, it is a desert. You don't see the boil-ups of fish. You don't see the massive flocks of birds predating on those fish. You see, the odd dolphin, but they're getting harder to come by. Can you talk to this about the state of the Gulf specifically? Is that in your wheelhouse, or?
I can certainly talk to the islands of the Gulf. The islands of the Gulf are certainly a success story in terms of recovering biodiversity and our environment. Over the last 2, 3, 4 decades, the Department of Conservation and other stakeholders have progressively cleared the islands of invasive species, notably rats, but also cats and ungulates. And the recovery has been astounding. So the The islands are in good shape, although there is certainly more work to be done. Kawo, Waiheke, Pōnui, those islands still have invasive predators present, and it would be wonderful one day to see the removal of those invasives from those islands realised.
An island like Waiheke, where essentially it's just a suburb of Auckland now, is it possible to eradicate pests on an island like that?
That is a question that's currently being explored. Te Karawai o Waiheke is a group that is focused on answering that question. They are right now working on the removal of stoats, and they have a large body of community support helping them with that. The question about rats, where really everybody in the community has to be on board if that's to be successful, is something that they're working on right now. So
in a case like Waiheke, do you go all out, eradicate as much as you possibly can? Let's say you get to 99% eradication, but then really it's a case of continual management.
Eradication does require the complete removal of every individual from within the population. For rat eradications in particular, you generally have one chance to get it right, and the planning that has to go into those projects has to be meticulous. Having achieved a 99% reduction in the population would not be enough. Rats would simply rebound, and within 1 or 2 years would be a major problem again. The ultimate goal for Waiheke and Kawo and other islands, Aotea as well, is to remove every last rat and bring in basic checks for those people visiting and living on those islands, so that rats are not brought back.
Just going back to the concept of a tipping point, you can have, and correct me if I'm wrong, but you can have a negative tipping point, and you can also have a positive tipping point. So once you were saying that these islands have amazing regenerative capabilities, so you remove the problem, and the tipping point can start going up rather than down. Is that correct?
Undeniably, yeah. Yes. Remove the invasive species that are the issue, and recovery is almost guaranteed. If I could talk for a moment about Hauturu and the removal of Kiore there.
That Hauturu, that's Little Barrier.
That's Little Barrier Island.
Kiore is?
Kiore is the Rattus excellans. It's the rat that arrived with early Polynesian voyages, and is a rat that has been spread right throughout the Pacific. It originated in Southeast Asia, certainly not native to New Zealand or
Did we have
Pacific.
native rats here?
No, our only native terrestrial mammals were bats.
Right.
Hauturu, or Little Barrier Island, is an incredible success story. I gave a presentation at a conference recently talking about the discoveries that have been made subsequent to the removal of rats and cats from the island. Since the removal of rats and cats, New Zealand Storm Petrel, a species that was once thought to be extinct, has been found to be breeding there. Oh. The chevron skink, which is found only on Hauturu and Aotea, is slowly increasing in number and is found more regularly. There was a species of butterfly that hadn't been seen for decades on Hauturu that was rediscovered. An aquatic insect that no one had seen or described before. And many reptiles that were previously at very low density have since recovered.
Right. So essentially the islands are our Noah's Ark of the future, aren't they?
They certainly are. Having those islands that are free of invasive species provide refugia for where we can hold on to those species that are on a knife edge, But the aspiration one day is to return those species that we've lost from the main islands of New Zealand and the larger islands in the Pacific. One day to have that biodiversity back on our doorsteps.
Yeah, so they become a genetic bank again, for the future. I'm going to ask a dumb question, but is it possible to remove rats and stoats from the whole of New Zealand?
I'm in the team of people that believe it is possible.
Yeah.
I do think we need to look at transformational technologies rather than just focusing on incremental improvements in trap design or methodology.
You're talking genetic?
Synthetic biology is a potential path that we certainly don't want to discount as an option in pursuing that dream of a predator-free New Zealand.
How does that work? So when you say, what did you say, synthetic?
Synthetic biology simply describes the approaches that use genetic techniques, whether it's actually editing genomes or searching for genes that already exist within a genome that can be exploited to reduce or eliminate pest populations.
How far away are we from that? Is it like the ultimate? It's obviously the ultimate nirvana, but most nirvanas you can never reach.
I don't think it's far away. The work that has been done on mosquitoes is very advanced, and they're actually undertaking trials, in situ trials, of the approach. Mammals are a different story, of course, but the technology is improving, and there is an association of organizations of which we're involved called GBIRD, which stands for Genetic Biocontrol of Invasive Rodents. There's a number of institutions in Australia and in the US, and New Zealand are included in that too, that are working on developing this technology in mammals, starting with mice. And maybe within the next decade we will see that technology being accessible. We do need to obviously get community buy-in for the technology, and asking those questions or informing the public about the technology and the risks associated with it will be critical to getting licensed to use it.
What are the risks?
The vision is to have a technology that has no risk or zero risk.
It's species specific.
Species specific, and would be contained within a population. Mm. So if the technology was released or made available on a particular island, there would be no risk of it being transferred or relocated elsewhere.
Well, because I suppose the ultimate risk is that it gets transferred to the species you're trying to save. But obviously there'd be enormous testing to confirm all those risks.
Yes,
you'd have the biggest risk management program ever, wouldn't you?
Yes, as conservationists, we certainly don't want to decrease the globe's biodiversity.
So
the technology would have to be proven safe.
Yeah, so you move forward at lightning speed on the technology, but in terms of its implementation, it's taken on a very risk-averse approach. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. Just going back to the marine environment, every 3 years the Hauraki Gulf Forum, which is an entity set up by the government to monitor the state of the Gulf and try and effect change. They do a scientific study called The State of the Gulf. I think it's called The State of Our Gulf, in fact. The latest one was this year, and just off the top of my head, these are some of the rather depressing statistics. These figures are all negative, and they are probably from a base population. I'm not quite sure, but what the base population is, but in a sense it doesn't really matter. But things like snapper are down 82% from their original fish stocks. Sea lions and seals are down just a mere 100%. Dolphins and particular whale, I can't remember, something down like 96%. Seabirds are down by 67%. Crayfish are functionally extinct. So that means that basically there are a few of them. Apparently the Hauraki Gulf was just one great big carpet from beginning to end of mussels, 100% gone. So it's all rather depressing. So just to use an analogy, it's not a particularly nice one, but maybe the rat of the ocean is humans. All this decline has, as I understand it, is coming from two areas: overfishing, that's an obvious one, and also increase in nutrients that are flowing from the land, from the intensive agricultural around the Hauraki Gulf. And also the third thing is sedimentation, which is runoff from the land as it's developed. When you have, and you obviously can speak to this, when you have vegetation, that prevents sedimentation of the sea. So apparently there are reefs in the Hauraki Gulf which are completely covered in mud, and so they're completely dead. So the problem is that it seems every man and his dog wants to go out and fish the Hauraki Gulf. I was very surprised to find out that the recreational fish take is 50%. That's what they think it is. They actually have no way of knowing accurately. And then the other fish take is commercial. You'll focus on islands, bringing back endangered species. We do have marine islands, underwater islands. We have marine reserves, and in the Hauraki Gulf it equates to 0.03%. I think I'm right on that. If it was 0.3%, it sort of doesn't really matter. It's well below 1. So just from your experience in terms of if you only had 0.3%, if you could shrink down all your islands that you work on to 0.03%, I mean, it's a dumb question. It's an obvious question. Your effectiveness would be pretty damn low, wouldn't it? So we have a major issue where when stocks of snapper, which are a much loved species by everyone who loves to eat fish, are down to 20% of what they used to be. It's less than 20% of what they used to be. As a layperson, it doesn't take much imagination to think there will be some tipping point. Or it's interesting. What is the tipping point? Once it gets down to 19 or is it 18? And this is the scary thing: is if we don't do anything, we'll very quickly get down to zero.
Yeah, my expertise is not in the marine environment, but I do play and fish in the Hauraki Gulf, and without a doubt, the marine biodiversity is not what it was in my father's day or my grandfather's day. The removal of the massive reduction in snapper numbers and crayfish numbers has resulted in what is described as kinner barrens, where the kinner populations have just completely gone mad and stripped all of the reefs of seaweed and other algae.
And that's because snapper eat kinner.
Yes, and the larger snapper.
Yeah, and so if you don't have the larger snapper, the kinner will just basically the ecosystem's getting out of balance, and so you don't have the predator eating the predator of the kelp. And the kelp's important, isn't it, in the ecosystem? It's essentially the trees of the sea.
Very much so, and it would be interesting to know if those reefs could be regenerated and that seaweed come back, how much of a carbon sink that would create. There is a movement that's gaining momentum right now that seeks to protect 30% of the world's oceans by 2030. It's called the 30-30 movement, not surprisingly. And that would be a wonderful vision for the Hauraki Gulf and for, of course, the rest of New Zealand, to have 30% of our marine environment protected, completely protected. That still leaves 2/3 of the area, marine area, available for recreational and commercial fishing. But if the important and representative habitats are protected within that 30%, then I think that we would see significant recovery of fish stocks and other marine biodiversity.
The 30% figure, just correct me if I'm wrong here, but 30% figure is because essentially on land we have 30% in reserve. Is that correct? Do you know that?
I don't
know. Roughly.
I don't know where that figure came from. I think it's a figure that might be realistic in terms of achievement, but also protecting 1/3 of our marine environment would have a massive beneficial impact on the entire marine environment.
Well, if anyone's been to Goat Island, which is one of the few marine reserves in Auckland, it is phenomenal. You just put your head down and you're inundated with fish. And also, I've been to the Poor Knights, which is also a marine reserve, and it's staggering how much fish are there. So I always think for people who love to fish, first of all, they've got to be aware of they do want to be able to have fish. They want to have as much fish as they can now and in the future. But the problem with having too much fish now is there won't be a future. And I'm sure that everyone who loves to fish want their children to be able to partake in the same resource that they've been lucky enough to partake in.
I would say that marine reserves are totally oversubscribed. If you've ever been up to Goat Island in the middle of summer, it's impossible to find a park. You can't find a space on the beach to sit, and the water is almost, the reserve is almost entirely full of snorkelers and scuba divers.
Yeah,
we need more marine reserves to share the.
I mean, there's massive benefits to both socially and economically on both fronts, on land front and on the sea front. For people who want to fish, there'll be more fish, and people who want to experience that incredible experience. It's like an underwater zoo that people can go to. In the Atlantic, on the American and Canadian Atlantic coast, about a century ago, they said you used to be able to walk on a carpet of cod, and there was just endless amounts of cod, cod for infinity. Essentially, they've all gone now. Is that likely to happen here with the current state of the Hauraki Gulf?
I think it already has. In parts of New Zealand, we've seen the same scenario play out. Blue cod in the Marlborough Sounds are a good example of a fishery that was once abundant, but now is just a shadow of its former self. In the Hauraki Gulf, if you talk to your grandparents or parents who used to fish in the Gulf, it was the golden age. the ability to go and throw a hook out just a stone's throw from the city of Auckland and be able to take home a fish for dinner was incredibly possible then. Now not so.
It's also interesting to think about how farmers farm. They don't farm 100% of their land all 100% of the time. They have to allow fields to lie fallow, so which means they don't graze on them. I don't know what periods of time, but it's probably a matter of months, whether it's a year or it doesn't really matter. But essentially, we are trying to farm 100% of the Hauraki Gulf. without leaving any of it fallow. So the whole concept of a reserve is in line with normal farming practices.
Yes, you're absolutely right, Michael. There are a lot of different ways in which you can protect your marine biodiversity. Having a temporary cessation of fishing activity is one possible alternative, a rahui, if you like. And that is a technique that's used all over the Pacific to protect and replenish fish stocks. But to have those areas where marine life is completely protected for now and forever is incredible. To be able to take your children to see what marine life ought to be like is well worthwhile, I believe.
Yeah, well, we need more than just Kelly Tarletons, don't we?
We do.
Yeah, so for anyone who doesn't know, Kelly Tarletons is a aquarium in Auckland. It's very, very popular, but we need multiple Kelly Tarletons actually in the real world. You know, New Zealand has a marketing slogan of 100% pure to advertise how incredibly clean and green and wonderful we are here. That's the branding that we have. You know, when you talk to people who come here, they want to come here because it is clean and green and all those sorts of things. I think we're hypocrites to an astounding level, and I think it's a very dangerous marketing strategy personally, because we only have to have a few things go wrong and then suddenly we've lost that slogan. You know, generally, just to finish off, what is the state of New Zealand ecologically? Are we hypocritical thinking that we're clean and green, or actually is there sort of a dark underbelly to what we're doing to our ecology?
I think you've answered that question, Michael. We are not 100% clean and green. We've seen that in the deterioration of our waterways, and many of our ecosystems still remain incredibly vulnerable. Our wetlands would be a good example where we've seen continued encroachment on the amount of wetland habitat we have in New Zealand. And we've been going backwards from a biodiversity perspective too, with many species threatened and many populations still in decline. We've had some local successes, and there's incredible momentum now building within the community to turn that tide around. But we have a long way to go to the point where we can sleep easily at night, knowing that our biodiversity is secure and recovering.
One thing we haven't touched on is invasive plant species. I'm currently trying to get a project off the ground on Waiheke, removing buckthorn from a part of the western coastline of Waiheke. Buckthorn is a species that takes over the shoreline. It's very, very similar to purakawa. It comes from South Africa, so this semi-tropical environment that we offer here it's just in heaven, basically. And it has these beautiful little red berries which birds love and spread with gay abandon, and is a major problem. Recently, I've discovered it on Rangitoto. Now, I would view, and you tell me what you think of this, I would view Rangitoto as one of New Zealand's jewels. Incredibly special place. From an environmental aspect, from its access to, proximity to Auckland, and in a sense, from a spiritual place, it's very unique feeling when you go there. Recently, I spent a weekend removing buckthorn from a very small area. I've spoken to the Department of Conservation about it. They've told me they have given up on their fight on buckthorn. They said they had a program which at one point was spending $180,000 per year removing pest plants, but they're saying they're overwhelmed by some other species, and they're not doing anything about the buckthorn. Now, seeing what I've seen both on the Waiheke coastline and on this part of Rangitoto, it's not very hopeful for Rangitoto. First of all, what's the problem with something like buckthorn getting established on these islands? And there's, it's not just buckthorn, there's moth plant and woolly nightshade and all sorts of other things. How does that affect the ecosystem, and is it a problem?
Good question, Michael. Weeds or pest plants are a major threat to the islands of the Hauraki Gulf. They spread more easily than rats and mice. Spread by the wind. The seeds of pest plants are spread by the wind, or as you mentioned, birds. And they get to the furthest islands of the Gulf from time to time. And all it takes is one seed to germinate and grow. That can lead to rapid encroachment in an ecosystem. And the weeds or pest plants that we're most concerned about are those that transform ecosystems. They can germinate under canopy. New Zealand forest tends to be relatively resilient to weed establishment, but there are some species like climbing asparagus, moth plant, and as you mentioned, buckthorn, that can establish in those environments, and they can outcompete the native species, and they can dominate, creating these monocultures or systems that are far less diverse biologically. So, and with these species, we need to aim for eradication on the islands, or control to what we call zero density, where those plants are not having an impact. If you take your foot off the pedal, you go backwards very fast, and to recover from letting things go is sometimes nigh impossible. So I'm as disappointed as you are to hear that the Department of Conservation has given up on buckthorn on Rangitoto and Motutapu. They did have a control program that was making progress, pushing it back from Rangitoto. But Rangitoto, for example, there's half of the island is still bare and open, and just wide open for buckthorn to come in and dominate. So it's a really scary proposition. The one technology that may provide some hope is biocontrol, which New Zealand has pioneered for pest plants. The rigorous testing that is undergone for agents that are generally species specific is really, really good. So
what is biocontrol?
Biocontrol is using an agent, most likely an organism, an insect perhaps, that was present where the species evolved. So for buckthorn, the insects that feed or slow it down in South Africa, if you could select one of those species that focuses solely on buckthorn, and that would have no impact on our native environment, native species, then that could be of benefit, and that might slow down the spread of a species such as buckthorn.
How far away are we from that?
I have no idea, but I know the person to talk to, Lindley Hayes of Landcare, Manaki Whenua. She leads a program looking at biocontrol agents for both New Zealand weed species and those in the Pacific.
Yeah, so what also concerns me about DOC, I don't want to bash them too much because I'm sure they do a great job, but the project I'm planning to get off the ground on Waiheke is actually a DOC reserve. I rang or emailed Auckland Council. They said, oh no, we have nothing to do with this. It's a dock reserve. So I contact a dock and they say, sorry, we don't have any resources. So the word manage should be put in inverted commas. So it's really up to the citizenry to actually get involved and try and make a difference, because there's only so much government organisations can do. They're definitely not the silver bullet.
Certainly not. The Department of Conservation does have limited resources, and it has to prioritise the investment of those resources into those issues that are most urgent. Auckland, you might be interested to know, I believe once vied for the title of weediest city in the world. And it's true that there are more, the exotic plants outnumber native plants, I think 3-1 in the Auckland region. And the situation has improved with border protection being increased, and biosecurity now is a lot better than it was. There's less chance that new invasive species will be brought into the country. But it's not to say that it won't happen.
That's reassuring, but the horse has bolted in many respects. We've got enough on our plate.
We certainly have enough on our plate to deal with already.
Yeah,
I quite agree.
So would you say the plant invasive species are more of a problem than the animal ones because they're harder to control?
It's certainly true that weeds are harder to eradicate than animal pests. But their impacts can be a lot slower to evolve. And so the threat that a species such as a rat poses, which is immediate extinction for those most vulnerable species, a transformer weed species might take decades or centuries to affect that. So we have time to react. But complacency is probably not a good option.
Not a great strategy.
No.
Yeah. I think something we haven't touched on is actually the aesthetic value. When we talk at the beginning of the conversation, we talked about, why do we care? Why do we care if animals die? Why do we care for biodiversity? But, there's it ties in with the whole myth we have about New Zealand, about it being a wonderful place and clean and green, and its environment is very special and unique. But it won't be unique for that long if we can't contain these invasive species. But there is a strong aesthetic value that underlies all those things I've just talked about, of maintaining what we have and enhancing it. I'm not a religious man or anything like that, but actually on a spiritual level, I think those things are important as well in how we see ourselves.
I agree. For me, my spirits are always lifted when I spend time in a part of New Zealand where biodiversity is thriving. And I find that really important to spend time in those places to remind myself of how special this part of the world that we call home is and what it could be like one day.
Okay, well, thank you very much for coming on the podcast. It was a great conversation.
Kia ora, Michael. Thank you very much.